She woke to a house that was terrifyingly empty. The man she had loved and protected for 34 years died in the night. Before she even opened her eyes, his body had already been removed by the people who legally held his name. Thick velvet curtains were pulled completely shut inside the Beverly Hills mansion. An older woman sat entirely alone on the edge of her bed in suffocating silence. Beside her, a single dachshund named Helena whined softly, scratching its claws against a wooden door that had just been fitted with a brand new brass lock. To understand why a woman once wrote a $1 million check to help save Hearst, we have to confront one of Hollywood's oldest lies. That same woman was later kept away from his funeral. Nothing in that room suggested romance or glamour now. The order of the house had already changed, and she understood that before anyone explained it. The law moved faster than grief. Before she had the chance to speak as the woman closest to him, others had already claimed the right to decide what came next. That mattered because the relationship had always lived in two worlds at once. In private, she had carried burdens closest to those of a wife. In law, she was still someone the legal family could push aside the moment procedure took over. In 1941, a film hailed by many critics as one of the greatest American movies ever made reached the screen. But for Marion Davies, the film created a public distortion she could not easily undo. The blinding white light flickering from the theater projector illuminated the vacant face and disastrously shrill singing voice of the character Susan Alexander Kane on the silver screen. She was portrayed as a talentless, perpetually dissatisfied singer, forcibly shoved onto the stage by an overbearing tycoon in a truly ridiculous manner. Many viewers and journalists treated Susan Alexander Kane as a distorted version of Marion Davies. The public connected Susan Alexander Kane to Marion Davies so strongly that the fiction often replaced the woman herself. Because Charles Foster Kane was widely understood as being based in part on William Randolph Hearst, many viewers connected Susan Alexander to Marion Davies. Hollywood did not need to employ physical violence or forced silence to achieve this destruction. They erased her legacy using a far more sophisticated and devastating method. The film's power made many viewers stop asking who Marion Davies really was. Once that confusion hardened, every surviving performance had to fight against a story audiences thought they already knew. The damage did not come from one bad review. It came from repetition, from gossip, from press shorthand, and from the prestige of a film people treated as unquestionable. The most unethical and cruel aspect of this classic film was not its attack on a dictatorial billionaire, but rather its ruthless distortion of a genuine artistic talent. The heavy, dust-covered storage canisters holding classic silent films like The Patsy tell a completely different story. Marion's raised eyebrow, physical precision, and comic timing tell a completely different story. That point matters because it corrects one of the most persistent myths about her life. Completely contrary to the talentless puppet depicted in Citizen Kane, Marion Davies was a gifted comedic actress who adapted to sound better than many silent era performers. That specific technological shift ruthlessly crushed the careers of countless major contemporary stars, yet she successfully adapted and thrived. The legendary director King Vidor clearly recognized her innate acting ability and her perfectly calibrated comic timing down to the exact second. She could do things many silent stars could not. She could hold stillness, timing, and speech in the same frame without losing precision. That made the distortion even harder to forgive, because the evidence against it had always been there on screen. The catastrophic damage Orson Welles inflicted upon her professional reputation was impossible to measure or properly compensate. You simply cannot logically debate or successfully sue a beloved artistic masterpiece that the entire world has already chosen to blindly worship. Marion was forced to remain perfectly silent and live long enough to bitterly watch a massive, beautifully crafted lie easily outlive the actual truth of her own existence. The ultimate tragedy was that her comedic brilliance was buried beneath someone else's fictional narrative. In time, the industry she helped build forgot what she had actually done. While the entire world smiled with smug satisfaction and pointed their fingers at her, Marion's reaction revealed a facet of her character that everyone deliberately ignored. She possessed absolute dignity, and that became clearer the more people tried to provoke her. The heavy brass telephone rang relentlessly inside the mansion. The furious, resentful voice of her older sister, Rose, echoed through the receiver, loudly demanding that they sue Orson Welles. Marion's manicured hand calmly placed the receiver back onto its cradle. Her breathing remained steady, and her quiet eyes looked out the window, betraying absolutely no resentment or any intention to retaliate. Later accounts suggest that Marion chose not to watch Citizen Kane. When provoked by her angry family to launch a counterattack, she delivered a single, coldly philosophical statement. She declared that Orson Welles had every right to make whatever movie he wanted, and she had no standing to teach him how to direct. That was the ultimate manifestation of unshakable dignity. But dignity does not mean she was not hurting deeply. It simply meant she absolutely refused to transform her personal pain and humiliation into cheap entertainment for the press and the eager public ever again. She chose to swallow her sharp anger whole. Long before Hollywood conspired to define her as a talentless mistress, she had already forged herself into a hardened survivor rising from impoverished streets. To understand the resolve that kept Marion standing, we have to turn back the clock. We have to leave the castle behind and return to the run-down theaters of Brooklyn. As a teenager, Marion Cecilia Duras stepped onto the stage and began building a career in show business. Picture the thin teenager standing nervously in front of a yellowed, stained mirror inside a cramped dressing room. The air was heavy with the smell of cheap, theatrical makeup. Her mouth twisted awkwardly as her jaw muscles locked tight. She fought a painful battle against the syllables trapped deep inside her throat by a severe childhood stutter. Heavy sweat beaded and rolled down her forehead after spending hours repeatedly trying to clearly enunciate a single line of dialogue. Marion was clearly not a fragile, naive flower, waiting passively for wealthy men to rescue her. She understood perfectly that she possessed natural comedic instincts and a sharp theatrical mind. However, she also recognized that her physical condition was a critical barrier capable of destroying her career before it even began. This severe speech impediment did not break her spirit or force her to quit. Instead, it compelled her to forge an iron discipline. She rehearsed 100 times harder than the other chorus girls. The young actress used her expressive face to compensate for her uncertain voice. She turned hesitation into physical comedy. That relentless dedication built a foundation of genuine artistic resilience. She steadfastly refused to let her own voice betray her grand ambitions. Her brilliant physical silence became the ultimate loudest part of her entire stage performance. Living a severely difficult life in a working-class household, alongside older sisters who were also struggling stage performers, she quickly grasped a brutal industry rule. She realized raw talent alone was never enough to guarantee long-term survival. A successful actress required a strong, marketable brand. A heavy charcoal pencil struck through the ethnic surname Duras on the theater's run-down casting board with a sharp, decisive line. The young woman carefully wrote the word Davies directly above it using elegant, flowing letters. This new name sounded crisp, clean, and always memorable to the American public. It was fully stripped of any complex religious or immigrant class associations that might hinder her progress. She did not choose the stage name Marion Davies out of vanity or a sudden desire for high society acceptance. This was a coldly calculated commercial decision to advance her own career independently. The choice was practical, but it also carried a deeper use. A new name gave her distance from the girl who had struggled over syllables and worried about being dismissed before she finished a line. On stage, the new name sounded cleaner, faster, and harder to forget. The new name was always easier to sell, much easier for audiences to remember, and perfectly suited to the bright neon lights illuminating the Broadway theater district. That point matters because it corrects one of the most persistent myths about her life. Marion was never a blank piece of clay molded from nothing by the powerful media tycoon William Randolph Hearst. Long before his expensive shoes ever stepped onto her path, she had already armored herself with brutal discipline. She possessed a masterful command of stage timing and the sharp survival instincts of a genuine working artist. This resilient performer built a foundation long before anyone offered to buy it. Her comedic brilliance was an inherent trait, polished through endless hours of solitary practice in the shadows. Under the name Marion Davies, she was ready to build a career on her own terms and with a stronger sense of who she wanted to become. The reinvention was not cosmetic alone. It gave her a cleaner public shape and a harder professional edge. By the time Hearst noticed her, she already understood how to present herself as someone the business could sell, remember, and underestimate at its own risk. It was precisely this sharp confidence that propelled her directly into the Ziegfeld Follies. Here, young women were ruthlessly evaluated by the powerful gaze of New York's wealthiest men. The atmosphere in the front row was always heavy and suffocatingly dark. A 53-year-old man, his face always expressionless and his eyes as sharp as razors, sat strangely still, watching her intently night after night. Dozens of extravagant bouquets of red roses and visibly expensive pieces of jewelry were quietly delivered to Marion's dressing room. William Randolph Hearst was not merely flirting with a 19-year-old chorus girl. He was aggressively deploying his massive media ecosystem to pull her permanently into his orbit. At his peak, Hearst controlled a chain of 28 newspapers and wielded enormous influence over American public opinion. This narrative certainly involves elements of a traditional romance, but it originated as a cold, calculated exercise in absolute power. A clever, street-smart girl from Brooklyn, was intelligent enough to fully grasp the profound implications when a media emperor suddenly focused his vast gravitational pull directly upon her. He possessed the vast wealth and political machinery to place the whole world beneath her dancing feet. Yet there remained one single thing on this earth he could never purchase for her. A spectacular castle with 110 rooms could not fill that void. Neither could a custom-built film studio or millions of newspapers praising her every day. For a woman moving through upper-class America, that absence mattered more than gossip alone. It marked the difference between being welcomed openly and being tolerated in private. No amount of promotion could change the fact that the central relationship of her life remained legally unfinished. The moment Marion stepped into his orbit, William Randolph Hearst triggered a massive financial and media machine, completely unprecedented in American history, to elevate his new lover. Massive industrial printing presses spun wildly throughout the night, screeching loudly as they pushed millions of pages bearing her carefully curated image onto busy newsstands every single morning. The key to the Ocean House in Santa Monica, a vast beachfront estate, was placed upon her vanity table. Hearst founded Cosmopolitan Pictures with a single, remarkably arrogant purpose in mind. The film studio was designed to serve as the exclusive, highly funded launchpad to transform Marion Davies into a cinematic superstar. He deployed the full firepower of his 28 daily newspapers to guarantee relentless, inescapable promotion across the country. This media empire actively manipulated art critics and essentially forced the American public to acknowledge her constant presence on the silver screen. She was instantly gifted houses the size of small villages and constantly showered with priceless ancient treasures imported directly from Europe. That protection also isolated her from the normal working life of an actress. He certainly shielded her from the harsh, fiercely competitive reality of the standard Hollywood studio system. Yet, simultaneously, he effectively imprisoned and isolated her entirely from the actual working world. She was securely trapped inside an incredibly expensive bubble built exclusively by his vast wealth and his deeply obsessive, uncompromising fixation on her public image. But despite his vast ability to move mountains or seamlessly turn white to black in the daily press, Hearst remained completely powerless before a sacred legal obstacle. A yellowed, aging marriage certificate holding absolute legal power lay perfectly still and inviolable inside a heavy steel safe on the east coast of the United States. It was protected fiercely by the steady, cold, and entirely uncompromising eyes of Millicent Hearst. She was the only legally recognized wife, the formidable woman who had already delivered exactly 5 male heirs to the powerful tycoon. William Randolph Hearst could use his seemingly endless fortune to easily bribe the top politicians, but he could never use his money to purchase a legitimate public status for Marion. Millicent was a deeply devout and highly conservative Catholic. Her strict faith and religious convictions simply did not permit the existence of the word divorce under any circumstances. From the year 1926 onward, Hearst and his wife lived completely separately in polite, orchestrated silence. They maintained a strictly established, unspoken agreement of permanent domestic division to avoid a public scandal. But the ultimate cruelty of this specific social system existed entirely on official, stamped paper. Until the day Hearst eventually closed his eyes and drew his final breath, Millicent remained the only woman on earth holding the legal identity of his wife. Marion possessed the magnificent coastal houses, the lavishly funded blockbuster films, the orchestrated journalistic praise, and his daily physical presence. Yet, the single defining legal metric that high society always used to evaluate a woman's true power was permanently denied to her. The legal last name of the man she devoted her life to would never belong to her. That left her exposed to the quiet judgments of a deeply hypocritical elite circle. Lacking the basic protection of a legal title, Marion actively compensated by making herself the irreplaceable heart of the sprawling estate of San Simeon. A formal political banquet at San Simeon could feel stiff and calculating. Then Marion entered the room, teased Winston Churchill, and the atmosphere changed. The sharp clinking of expensive crystal glasses cut through the air, while a rich, genuine warmth radiated outward to fill a massive space stuffed entirely with cold, lifeless European antiquities. During the 1920s, San Simeon served as the absolute center of the Hollywood and political universes. Legends like Charlie Chaplin, Winston Churchill, and George Bernard Shaw all desperately wanted to pass through its heavy doors. Shaw once famously remarked that the sprawling castle was exactly what God would have built if he had the necessary money. But cold, solid marble blocks do not know how to genuinely smile or welcome a traveler. Hearst was the man who wrote the massive checks to construct the towering walls, but Marion was the one who actually made the daunting architecture breathe. She was a masterful, observant hostess. She used her natural grace, sharp intelligence, and innate comedic timing to soften Hearst's rigidity, seamlessly connecting the massive, fragile egos seated around the long dining table. Without her consistent warmth and social navigation, San Simeon was merely an expensive, ostentatious, and soulless museum. She softened a cold stone castle, but she remained completely powerless to change a much crueler truth. His influence kept pulling her away from the work she did best. When absolute control masquerades as love, it forces you into the heaviest, most dazzling costumes, just to hide the fact that you are locked onto the wrong stage entirely. The greatest professional tragedy for a performing artist is not lacking talent. It is being forcibly manipulated by external power to perform brilliantly on entirely the wrong stage. The bright, unforgiving studio lights harshly illuminated Marion, who was tightly squeezed into an incredibly heavy, heavily structured Renaissance corset. Her face was buried beneath layers of thick, theatrical makeup as she awkwardly attempted to project the profound sorrow of a doomed historical queen. Now, consider a faded piece of archival film cutting sharply across that image. It shows Marion dressed in incredibly simple, everyday clothing. She delivers a razor-sharp satirical raised eyebrow and executes a masterful, perfectly timed juggling routine that makes the entire film crew burst into genuine, unscripted laughter. William Randolph Hearst loved her with an obsessive, fiercely dictatorial intensity, and he firmly demanded that the entire world bow down in deep reverence before her. Consequently, he used his massive influence to force her into heavy, highly academic cinematic roles. She was cast as solemn queens, tragic duchesses, and mournful historical figures. This proved to be a fatal artistic error. Hearst did not intentionally destroy Marion's career because he harbored any secret hatred for her. He systematically dismantled it because he loved her strictly through the highly controlling, deeply conservative lens of an older, powerful man. He fundamentally dismissed comedic acting as inherently cheap and entirely unworthy of her elevated status. Meanwhile, the legendary director King Vidor and many astute film critics clearly recognized the absolute truth. Marion was born to perform comedy. She possessed a flawless, entirely natural stage timing that required absolutely no forced acting. The tycoon's suffocating, deeply selfish affection effectively robbed her of the vital opportunity to be recognized by the cinematic world for her actual brilliant capabilities. That was the contradiction at the center of her stardom. Hearst spent enormous sums to make her visible, yet visibility under his terms narrowed what the public could actually see. The more he insisted on grandeur, the harder it became for audiences to meet the quick, funny performer she really was. That is why the damage lasted. The public saw luxury, scale, and advertisement, then mistook them for proof of limitation. The machine built around her did not simply enlarge her image. It also narrowed the range of qualities most people were allowed to notice. Despite being suffocated within these completely misguided film scripts, Marion firmly refused to become a passive, blindfolded financial puppet. A sharp, decisive signature slashed across the bottom of a highly lucrative, independent personal contract, entirely free from Hearst's heavy shadow. A small, unassuming leather notebook meticulously recorded her extensive personal real estate investments. She kept it carefully hidden inside a locked desk drawer, maintaining a strict separation from the massive, sprawling accounting system operating at San Simeon. Hearst was born with a silver spoon, effortlessly spending massive fortunes without a single second thought. Marion, however, was raised in the gritty, working-class neighborhoods of Brooklyn. There, she absorbed a brutal, fundamental lesson straight into her bones. The money definitively stops flowing the exact second the work ceases. The mocking public narrative insisting that Marion survived strictly by living off Hearst was a deeply lazy, highly malicious oversimplification. The documented truth was far more complex and significantly more impressive. She personally negotiated her own highly lucrative contracts, steadily earning $10,000 a week throughout the 1920s. That was a staggering, almost unbelievable sum for that era. She strategically channeled those massive earnings into highly intelligent real estate investments. She certainly accepted Hearst's massive financial backing to produce her major films. Yet, simultaneously, she actively constructed an impenetrable, highly fortified financial wall to independently secure her own long-term survival. Her fierce financial independence allowed her to navigate the treacherous business world, but a living, breathing secret existed that no amount of money could permanently conceal. A small, timid girl named Patricia nervously darted down the cavernous, echoing hallways of San Simeon. She quickly slipped past the imposing, tailored figures of Clark Gable and Charlie Chaplin. To many observers, the child's features invited the same old rumors that had followed Marion and Hearst for years. Yet, the official birth certificate stated unequivocally that the child's mother was actually Marion's own biological sister. Around 1919, Marion disappeared from public view for a period, and later rumors held that this absence concealed the birth of Patricia Lake. The child was named Patricia, to absolutely ensure the pristine moral reputation of the powerful, legally married media mogul, Patricia was permanently stripped of her true identity. From then on, Patricia was publicly presented as Marion's niece. Marion was forced to silently endure the heavy stigma of carrying on an illicit affair. Even worse, she had to swallow her own silence and humiliation to fiercely protect the explosive secret regarding her own flesh and blood. This was a catastrophic truth that, if ever leaked to the press, could instantly detonate and destroy the entire legal and political framework surrounding Hearst. The young child grew up surrounded by the most extravagant, exclusive parties in the world. Yet, not a single invited guest was ever permitted to look too closely at the little girl's face. She gritted her teeth and safeguarded that agonizing, tear-soaked secret for decades to ensure his kingdom remained entirely intact. And when that very same kingdom finally began to burn uncontrollably, she was once again the only person willing to sacrifice herself to carry the water. In the year 1937, the massive bubble of megalomania and unrestrained spending finally burst with a devastating impact. The sprawling Hearst Corporation found itself staring directly into a terrifying existential crisis. Picture the thick, red stamped foreclosure notices piling up chaotically on the tycoon's massive, imposing mahogany desk. Imagine the grim, completely expressionless, gray faces of the top Wall Street bankers as they ruthlessly delivered the dreaded word foreclosure directly to the formerly arrogant media emperor. The legendary sprawling castle of San Simeon itself was placed firmly on the chopping block, waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated. Over decades, Hearst had built a habit of reckless spending. By 1937, the resulting debt had grown beyond his ability to repay it. The hilltop estate he had begun in 1919 was at risk. So were his European art collection and large parts of the media empire he had built. The mighty media king had entirely lost the practical ability to save himself from this financial ruin. His massive, terrifying machine of influence suddenly ground to a complete halt, completely paralyzed, trembling, and operating with absolute impotence. The man who had effortlessly shaped the political consciousness of an entire nation was now entirely at the mercy of creditors. The invincible empire was shaking violently, threatening to collapse and bury everything he had built underneath a mountain of unpaid obligations and shattered dreams. This was the golden moment where any pragmatic, calculating gold digger would rapidly pack her bags, gather her remaining valuables, and vanish entirely into the night. Marion Davies chose to do the exact opposite. The diamond and ruby necklaces, gifts from a 20-year reign, were packed into ordinary boxes. Marion was preparing to turn them into cash. She wrote a personal check for $1 million. Then she slid it across the desk toward Hearst in silence. This dramatic sacrifice was not a calculated theatrical gesture designed to generate good press or public sympathy. In the Great Depression, $1 million was an extraordinary sum. That check carried enough weight to stop the immediate foreclosure threat and help save San Simeon. If Marion had stayed with Hearst only for money, she would not have destroyed her own financial security to help him. She would have stepped away. That check remained strong evidence of how far she was willing to go for Hearst. The gesture also cut through the old stereotype with unusual force. Opportunists protect their exit when fortunes collapse. Marion did the reverse. She tied herself more tightly to Hearst at the exact moment the arrangement looked least useful to anyone thinking only in terms of advantage. Yet it also highlighted a deeply bitter, inescapable tragedy. She emptied her entire safety net and sacrificed her own wealth to rescue an empire that, according to rigid legal documents, could never actually bear her name. She helped save the fortune of a man who could not offer her a legal title. That act said more about her devotion than any public defense ever could. That act also explains why the old caricature never fit. A calculating opportunist protects distance when money vanishes. Marion moved closer. She put her own reserves at risk when many people would have stepped away. She did it without any legal guarantee that the loyalty would ever be returned. That massive check successfully secured the heavy stone walls of San Simeon, but it completely failed to save something much more fragile. The glittering neon sign of Cosmopolitan Pictures was quietly dismantled in absolute silence and unceremoniously dumped into a dusty storage corner. At 40, Marion stood before the camera for the last time on the set of Ever Since Eve in 1937. To survive the brutal financial restructuring and slash massive operating costs, Hearst was forced to completely shut down the Cosmopolitan Pictures film studio. There would be no more massive budgets, no more lavish costumes, and no more custom-written scripts specifically designed to elevate her status. Confronting this stark reality, Marion made the calculated decision to step away from the silver screen entirely. She did not leave the industry because her talent failed or because audiences had turned against her. She left because the machine around Hearst ran out of money. Her professional life was tied so tightly to Hearst's financial lifeline that when he collapsed economically, she was left without a single inch of stage to stand upon. She actively chose to retreat deep into the shadows to become a silent caregiver for a fading old man. But Hollywood was not finished reshaping her public image. Only 4 years after Marion stepped away from the spotlight, a young cinematic genius returned her name to the public. He did it through a false image that stuck. By then, Marion's career had receded into the past, and the aura of San Simeon had collapsed. What remained was a life stripped of applause, glamour, and studio light. A perfectly manicured hand that once proudly wore million-dollar jewelry now trembled violently, carefully measuring out exact, life-sustaining drops of bitter medication into a small silver spoon. The weak, rattling, and agonizing cough of William Randolph Hearst echoed pitifully throughout the cavernous, entirely empty Beverly Hills mansion. An empty liquor bottle lay casually discarded in the dark corner of Marion's quiet bedroom. It was the absolute only narcotic capable of keeping her standing upright through those endless, suffocating nights. Loving a supremely powerful tycoon for over 30 years did not mean existing constantly in a carefree world of sparkling champagne and imported silk dresses. In the final stretch of their long relationship, love took on a harsher shape. It became medicine, drawn curtains, lawyers waiting for the estate, and an exhausted woman with no legal title carrying the daily burden of care. The crushing, relentless psychological pressure pushed her steadily deeper into the bottle-seeking escape. But all of that profound, total devotion was rendered entirely meaningless and instantly crushed by the sheer, undeniable, and overwhelming force of the strict legal code and rigid, unforgiving bloodlines. It was the dark, heavy night of August 14th, 1951, The silence of the Beverly Hills mansion did not last. Hearst's sons arrived with lawyers, briefcases, and the authority of the legal family. Marion stared with absolute, helpless, and uncomprehending panic as she was forcefully and aggressively pushed down onto her own bed. A cold, sterile needle containing a highly powerful sedative was driven sharply and unapologetically straight into her vein. Hearst, at the advanced age of 88, was struggling violently for his absolute final ragged breaths. The individuals legally holding the Hearst surname immediately swarmed the massive property, seizing total and absolute spatial control over every single room. They instantly transformed the quiet home she had meticulously maintained into a freezing, ruthless, and heavily guarded headquarters for rapid asset transfer. Marion reacted with explosive, desperate fury to this heartless, incredibly noisy invasion, suffering a severe psychological collapse right there in the brightly lit hallway. Later accounts say Marion was given a sedative and kept away. That detail captures the distance between the public story and what happened in the room. Hearst exhaled his last rattling breath, entirely surrounded by the stern men who legally shared his famous name. The woman who had spent 34 years beside him was lying unconscious in a chemically induced sleep, cut off from the room where his final hours were being managed. When Marion finally opened her heavy eyes and emerged from the thick chemical haze, her entire world had been systematically robbed. The massive bedroom felt incredibly hollow and chillingly cold. Hearst's frail body had been rushed away with aggressive speed, leaving no physical trace he had ever lived there. Every single one of his personal belongings had been ruthlessly swept into packing crates. A sharp, dry click echoed loudly from the brand-new brass lock the Hearst operatives had hastily installed during the night. Little Helena barked weakly, staring in total confusion through the narrow doorway. The tycoon's remains were swiftly transported 500 miles north to San Francisco for an elaborate state funeral. Inside that grand church, Millicent Hearst marched proudly to the very front row, claiming her absolute role as the legitimate widow before the entire watching nation. Meanwhile, Marion was completely isolated in Beverly Hills. When she quietly lied to the attending nurse, claiming she had intended to go to the church but decided to stay alone, it was not cowardice. It was the bitter realization of her unchangeable status. She had lived devotedly as a loyal wife, carried the heavy burdens of a wife, and emptied her bank accounts to save him like a wife. At the exact moment when law and death mattered most, she was pushed back into the role of an outsider. She had permanently lost the only man she loved, lost her public voice, and was blatantly stripped of the right to shed tears in public. But one final reversal still remained, and it would come from the legal papers left behind. The Hearst family arrogantly believed they had successfully pushed Marion out of the public story. They did not anticipate that, hidden within his secret will, the tycoon handed her leverage powerful enough to force a serious legal confrontation. The insult was not only emotional, it clarified the hierarchy that had governed the relationship from the beginning. She could nurse, protect, pay, and endure. But at the ceremonial moment that confirmed status, the law recognized someone else. That hard fact may have hurt even more than the locked door itself. It also explained the loneliness of the years that followed. She had been central when devotion was needed and peripheral when legality took over. The structure did not merely humiliate her once. It revealed that the boundary had been there all along. The people who carried the Hearst name assumed they had stripped her of everything, but they miscalculated entirely. A massive, legally binding document sat heavily on the desk, directly in front of Marion. The documents gave Marion control over a huge block of Hearst Corporation stock, enough to confront the family with a serious legal problem. A fountain pen moved swiftly and decisively across the thick parchment. In a matter of seconds, she signed that power away. She returned it to the same people who had locked her out in the middle of the night. In his final will, William Randolph Hearst left Marion a huge block of Hearst Corporation stock, enough to create a serious legal problem for the family. That single document granted her significantly more executive authority than all of his legally recognized sons combined. She had the legal power to force a serious fight with the Hearst heirs if she chose to. However, instead of transforming into a spiteful, vengeance-seeking adversary, she sat perfectly still. She quietly listened to her attorneys meticulously explain the vast extent of her new power, and then she systematically dismantled it. She firmly signed the papers, immediately handing the entire empire back to the Hearst family without a single demand. She chose to retain only a minor trust fund, generated from 30,000 shares, just enough to sustain herself quietly for her remaining years. This was not an act of fear, and it certainly was not a display of weakness. It was a spectacular display of profound, unbreakable pride. She could have used those shares to force an ugly reckoning in court. Instead, she chose a cleaner separation. By refusing to fight for the empire at last, she rejected the final chance to define herself through Hearst's name, even when the law briefly handed her leverage. She fundamentally refused to cling to a kingdom that had stubbornly refused to legally recognize her name for over 3 decades. The sprawling, oppressive empire of the media magnate was finally left behind her. It was time for Marion to build a lasting legacy under her own authentic name. The bright, polished bronze lettering of the Marion Davies Children's Clinic gleamed proudly in the California sun on the campus of UCLA. A simple, cold stone marker resting in the quiet grounds of the Hollywood Forever Cemetery bore only one single, highly independent name: Marion Davies. It was entirely free from the heavy shadow of any powerful man's surname. She gave $1.9 million to establish the Marion Davies Children's Clinic at UCLA. That staggering donation was even larger than the desperate check she had previously written to rescue the stone walls of San Simeon. Hearst constructed a massive, intimidating stone castle specifically to project the overwhelming aggressive dominance of a male patriarch. Marion, in sharp contrast, built a working hospital to demonstrate the profound compassion of a woman whom the entire world had misjudged for her entire adult life. In 1961, she quietly passed away from stomach cancer at the age of 64. There was absolutely no massive state funeral, and there were no grand national headlines mourning her departure. But as she was lowered into the earth, she achieved the ultimate, absolute liberation. She died and was buried entirely under her true identity as Marion Davies. She was not Mrs. Hearst, and she was certainly not anyone's discarded mistress. She belonged completely and exclusively to herself at the very end. Marion carried the heaviest, most devastating secret of her life quietly into her grave. But buried truths always possess a relentless, inevitable way of finally clawing their way to the surface. The erratic, shallow breathing of an elderly Patricia Lake echoed through a sterile hospital room in Rancho Mirage in 1993. Her pale lips barely moved as she desperately whispered her final, shocking confession directly into the ear of her son, a mere 10 hours before she finally stopped breathing. For decades, Hollywood lived on rumor. In her final hours, Patricia Lake asked that the record be set straight and identified Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst as her parents. The Los Angeles Times later reported the claim, helping push the old rumor into the public record. The claim did not erase every ambiguity around the story, but it altered the way the old rumor was heard. What had long been dismissed as gossip now carried the weight of a final request, made when there was no longer much reason to protect anyone. Marion had forced herself to silently endure the crushing public shame and the quiet whispers until the day she died. An immensely powerful love affair, completely lacking a legal marriage license, did not merely strip the woman of her rightful public status. It also ruthlessly produced a child who was forced to exist in the shadows for an entire lifetime, permanently forbidden from using the true names of her own parents. Every single dark, closely guarded secret was ultimately dragged into the harsh daylight, leaving behind a profoundly haunting question regarding a completely stolen existence. When the heavy dust from decades of carefully constructed lies finally settled to the ground, historical justice slowly began to speak. Yet, that vital correction only arrived long after the woman who most needed to hear it was already buried deep beneath the earth. She sacrificed youth, money, privacy, and reputation for a man who could never legally claim her. Completely contrary to the ruthless caricature that Hollywood actively sold to the public, Marion Davies was never an untalented puppet designed merely for cheap laughs. She deliberately handed a powerful tycoon absolutely everything he could never legally demand. In return, the law still pushed her outside the name she had spent decades defending.